Hey Jews, today we're going to take a look at a recent video that came out that's called What You're Not Supposed to Know About Hassidic Jews. This is from the YouTube channel Unpacked. You can see the description there. And we're going to go through it. I would like to appeal to those Jews who have righteousness in your heart, who care about tzedek, about the truth actually. So let's go through and learn from this video, which I think is pretty good. And we'll learn a little bit more about what's happening also in our day in Judaism and how we can understand this within the context of the Chevlei Mashiach, the end times that we're in, and what's going on.
Sooner or later, you'll see them. Hasidic Jews are instantly recognizable. But with all that recognition comes all sorts of assumptions. You've heard the stereotypes. They're the most authentic Jews, or they're super extreme, or they're stuck in the past. Well, I'm about to blow your mind, because Hasidic Judaism actually started as a rebellion. For centuries, rabbinic elites acted as gatekeepers, guarding a rationalist form of Judaism meant only for scholars. Then a miracle-working mystic came along and turned everything upside down. What happened next ignited a war that almost tore Judaism apart. So, who are the rebels who turned Judaism on its head? Hasidim are so iconic that they've become synonymous with all Jews. But the movement is actually only a few centuries old.
So he says a lot of things in this introduction. Basically that there was a rebellion against the gatekeepers of the information encoded in the Torah and entrusted to the nation of Israel to pass down in an unbroken chain throughout time. Now, there was a time in history where a lot of the simple folk, the Jews, became illiterate, and especially in the holy language of Hebrew, which is, by the way, why Rav Yaakov Kuli took it upon himself, he was a genius, to create the anthology of the Torah, the Ma'am Lo'az, which is, initially he did it in Ladino, but it is now available in every language. I have it in English, and I have learned so much Torah from Ma'am Lo'az, and this is available in our time. So there's no real reason for people to shy away from learning Torah because we don't know Hebrew perhaps, and everything has commentary anyway. But we can see that this was a rebellion going against the ways and the traditions. And this is something that is written in Deuteronomy 13. Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you. Neither add to it nor take away from it, meaning no new ways. So while at the time it may have seemed like a legitimate thing to do because people felt left out and everybody's feelings got hurt, that they weren't the intellectual giants that guarded this sacred information, they also wanted a way to express their love for God and to feel a connection with God. So we're going to learn a little bit more about how this started. Again, he says, as a rebellion, and we will continue to learn.
Tracing its origins to 1700s Ukraine. It was a harsh time and place to live, particularly for Jews. All peasants suffered from crushing poverty and the constant threat of exploitation from the landowners who rented out the fields where they eked out a meager living. But only Jews had to worry about being slaughtered by their neighbors. Anything could set off a pogrom, from a populist uprising to, hey, it's Sunday. So the Jewish communities of Ukraine did their best to manage their own affairs. From religious matters to civil disputes to education and even welfare, the Jewish community kept it all in-house, reluctant to turn to non-Jews unless absolutely necessary.
So this is a little bit misleading, as it seems to imply that the reason the Jews kept everything in-house and had their own rabbinical courts and whatnot is because of the random violence of the surrounding goyim that could happen at any time. And so this is actually not the reason. The reason is that God sent us into exile, and we are expected in exile surrounded by all the 70 nations, we are expected to still uphold the laws of the Torah, which is why we are a nation at all, is because we accepted the chukim and the mishpatim, the laws and the ordinances, the commandments that God gave us to live by. So that's the reason.
At the top of the Jewish social hierarchy were the rabbis, who had been educated in the elite study houses of Poland and Lithuania. These were serious scholars who spent their days poring over the Talmud and debating the most minute points of Jewish law. Education has always been a form of social currency among Jews, and these 1%ers were the gatekeepers, answering questions, arbitrating disputes, and defining Jewish practice for their impoverished communities.
Yes, so as previously mentioned, the Torah is very difficult to understand. One needs to have, first of all, a lot of information. So one needs to study day and night and obtain all of this information. And then one must think about this information constantly and grind it down to try to make it make sense. And then to teach it and lead the nation via the Torah. So yes, he makes it sound like it's an elitist thing or not very fair that the smart people led the nation. Why do the smart people have to lead the nation? Why not have it like it is today where everyone's just doing their own thing?
Their communities were impoverished, not just financially, but spiritually too.
I would say literacy was at a very low level. They would understand, if anything, the basic ability to read a prayer book at best, and no sense of spirituality. A sense that spirituality is something for the elite few far away. But they were living in, I think, a generation of tremendous darkness.
Your average Ukrainian Jew could only dream of entering the famed study halls of Poland or Lithuania.
They feel disenfranchised and maybe even a little bit disrespected.
This is very legitimate. The feeling of being disenfranchised or not belonging, not understanding, maybe at that time also not having the access to the information was very limiting to a lot of Jews. And again, that's legitimate. And this is something we also can learn from the Gemara in Brachot 28a, where we learned that Rabbi Gamliel was the head of the Sanhedrin, but he made it difficult for everyone to enter and learn, and instead had very strict requirements. But when he was taken from that position and Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah took his place, he opened it up to everyone. And, everyone can learn Torah. It's only going to you're only going to understand to your own ability. So that's why we should always have very good teachers. And I guess at this time, we're not going to get ahead of myself here, talking about today yet. But at that time, when Hasidut was just starting, this is legitimate. It's legitimate to want to have a place in the community, to want to understand. But again, the way to do that is to learn the information, not to do something new and not to rebel and do some completely different things, as we're going to see.
And they still have an intense spiritual longing that is undoubtedly associated with the kind of spiritual influences of the entire region, the closeness to nature, and they want to find a way to express it.
Indeed, a lot of Hasidic and Ashkenazi Jewish customs are actually taken from their surroundings, from the Goyim, like braiding the challah bread. That's not something that Jews were doing. That's something that they took from the Goyim, their showbread for their festivals to their gods, that was later copied and incorporated into Judaism. And we are not supposed to do this. Yes, nature is very inspiring, and we can learn a lot about the wisdom of God and the creation and get closer to God by observing nature. But what's the difference between all the other people of the world, all the other nations that are inspired by nature and that go out and worship nature? So a lot of the Hasidic customs and traditions and the ways that they felt were helping them get closer to God are in fact the ways that all the other people of the world also feel connected to God. They also are inspired by the sun, the sunrise and the sunset, and by the beauty of nature. The nation of Israel is separate and holy. We have a whole bunch of laws that we were given to live by. This is the essence of Judaism. This is the reason, again, that we were singled out and became the holy nation, was because of the laws, not because of our love of God, not because of our fervor and anything else, not because of our joy. This is specifically what we need to understand, that it's the laws that separate us from all the other nations.
So they relied on community rabbis to settle any questions they might have had, which meant that the common Jew more or less did whatever the rabbis told them to, even if they didn't understand why. But their lack of education didn't diminish their utter devotion, both to God and to a worldview steeped in magic and mysticism. Jewish tradition acknowledges the existence of the supernatural, and over the centuries, different communities have developed their own rituals and superstitions to ward off demons, heal the sick, lift curses, predict the future, etc.
There's such a long millennial history of Jews turning to various theurgic devices, meaning amulets and scraps of prayer or red threads and things like that, in order to act as a kind of physical prayer, as a kind of a prayer made manifest in a physical form, as an act to, shape the universe in which we live.
Now, your average Jew found it difficult to call on God. So the Jews of Ukraine turned to Baal Shem, miracle workers whose title translates to masters of the name.
So notice that he says masters, Baalei Shem Tov, masters plural of the good name. There were many such people that went from town to town looking for ignorant, uneducated Jews to sell charms to sell blessings to, whatever they were doing there. And in Deuteronomy, in Dvarim 13, God already tells us that there could appear people amongst us that are showing signs and wonders and doing certain things, and that we should not heed their words and don't follow them, because God is actually testing us with this to see if we really love God. We have to understand also that the way God created reality is with a spiritual dimension. It's spiritual, shamayim va'aretz. And we can learn about this, and we can try to understand, again, to the best of our ability. So it's natural that we feel things, that we have intuition, that we know about things like angels and demons. That's known to us. But it's not a mystery in that we can't understand it. Everything at the end of the day is logical. And that's why we need to learn the information. Now, back in their day, they were illiterate. They didn't have as much access to information as we do today. But yet the same thing continues to happen, because first of all, there are a lot of people amongst the Jews that are part of the Erev Rav, and they need a central figure. They want to worship a person. So that's a lot of people. That's the majority of the people in every generation are Erev Rav, who need to attach themselves to somebody like a JC or some other figure like the Baalei Shem Tov. And again, there were many such people. And that is why we see many different groups of Hasidim. But in today's world, we have access to a lot of information that they didn't have access to. We have information now translated to every language. So we're not illiterate potato farmers anymore that can't connect to God via our intellect, which is what the Rambam in Chagiga in the Gemara tells us, that it's the intellect. We have to understand God created all of creation with a different level of consciousness and ability to understand his wisdom. Now, are you able to understand a lot of concepts, difficult concepts today? Yes, we are all more able. Our minds have been developed, our intellect has been developed, and now we have access to the information. So there's no more reason that we need to rely on a Baal Shem Tov, on somebody giving out charms and amulets and blessings and to heal us. No, we can access and understand this information, which is what God expects of his holy nation.
These masters were said to know the names of angels, demons, evil spirits, even God himself. They worked miracles by drawing on Kabbalistic tradition to evoke these names. But these Baalei Shem served another function for the desperate communities of 18th century Ukraine.
They dedicated themselves to not just Torah and mastery and halacha and the Talmud, which they all, of course, had in spades, but
So this guy says that, of course, they all knew the halacha and they were very well versed in the Torah and they knew everything. There's no actual evidence of this because none of those Baalei Shem Tov, and especially not the one that they've made into the legend of the Besht, has written any books. Like all of the other rabbis throughout history, like the Gaon from Vilna, like the Ramchal, like everybody else who has books and has manuscripts and has everything that they think and they taught with a source in the Torah. Because everything that a Jew thinks, especially about reality, especially about God, especially about connecting to God, especially about being the holy nation, has to have an actual source in the Torah. And because there is no source in the Torah, they go out into the forest, not even in Eretz Israel, so in a land that is tameh by nature, impure by the nature of the fact that it's not Eretz Israel. They went out there in the Ukraine and into the forest, and they connected with something spiritual. And then they told you it's God. But God here is saying, don't follow that. Don't do anything new. So again, at the time that it was started, perhaps it was legitimate for them at that time. They had no access to actual information that they could understand. But in today's date, there is zero reason for Jews to just go along with an excommunicated ideology. It was excommunicated when it was started. At the very beginning, they said, uproot this from your community. And for 100 years, they fought against this because this is not the correct way to connect to God. And you can see, after so many years and thousands of people in these cults, why has the Mashiach not come? Because this is not what God has told us that he wants from us. And in fact, he told us he will test us with this. And this keeps happening over and over again. So you, smart Jew, you can learn about these excommunications. You can learn the Torah. It's not something far away from you. It's something that's in your heart. You already know it because your soul comes from God and your soul has this information of the objective truth. So it's just reconnecting with that, and that is the information. So continue watching this video if you'd like, and keep in mind the fact that this was all excommunicated 3 times. So, I mean, in our day, we see this happening again, and there's no real reason except for the fact that people want to allow themselves to do all sorts of other things. You want to have alcohol. You want to mix men and women together. You want to say that we're just coming together in unity of the Am Yisrael. But this is not what God wants from us. This is not the way to connect to God as his holy nation. So, I mean, all of the information is available to you and you can understand it.
The practical, experiential, supernatural, mystical elements, what they would actually spend their days doing is going from community to community, town to town, finding people who are widows or orphans or impoverished, finding jobs for them, work for them. They would teach, they would bring people in and educate the kids.
Some Baalei Shem were truly learned people steeped in Kabbalistic tradition. Others had some medical knowledge which they used to heal. But some were nothing more than charlatans, preying on the gullible with amulets they couldn't read, rituals they didn't understand, and quack remedies that did nothing. So it was a badge of honor to be not just a Baal Shem, but a Baal Shem Tov, a master of the good name. The more miracles you worked, the more likely you were to be seen as the real deal. And there was no one more real than the man who kicked off the entire Hasidic movement. A figure so iconic that today, he's simply known as the Baal Shem Tov. Of course, the Baal Shem Tov, or Besht, hadn't always been known by this name. He was born Israel ben Eliezer. Though details of his life are scarce and subject to change depending on the narrator, here's what we do know.
A major breakthrough from the historical point of view came when a great scholar at Bar-Ilan University took advantage of the collapse of communism and went back and actually went into these Polish archives, which until then were largely closed to Western researchers. They don't reflect the same kind of miracle working and things like that, but what they do reflect is the fact that he was clearly an individual who was held in great regard by the Jewish community. He's not a figment of the imagination of later generations, but that he was a person of considerable stature and leadership by the time we get to the second half of the 18th century.
Those are the sorts of details that excite historians. But if you ask a Chassid about the life of the Baal Shem Tov, they'll take a different approach.
He was the last receiver of a very ancient tradition of Jewish spiritual practice that was rooted deeply in Kabbalah, and not just the theoretical Kabbalah, but the actual transformational, experiential, prophetic elements of the Kabbalistic tradition. He was a supernatural healer that would create miraculous healings, channeling divine energies and consciousness and meditation techniques, etc. He brought together the mystical experiential path and really delivered that in a revolutionary way, not just to the elite, but said every potato farmer, it's time that they were given access to this knowledge and experience.
But the Baal Shem Tov wasn't just any miracle worker. He was a teacher and a leader who deeply loved his fellow Jews. Most rabbinic elites scorned the poor and barely literate common man. But the Baal Shem Tov treated everyone, no matter how uneducated, as a precious spark of the divine. Sure, the average Jew didn't know enough to debate the Talmud, but there were other equally valid avenues to God. Like singing, wordless, repetitive songs that propelled the singers into a meditative state from which they could better communicate with God. Or like stories, cryptic parables meant to make the audience think deeply about morality and ethics. Or like ecstatic dance during prayer, turning every synagogue into a swaying, jumping, whirling chaos that transported its congregants ever closer to God. The Baal Shem Tov probably didn't intend to kick off a revolution, but his devotion to his fellow Jews and his insistence that anyone could grow close to God struck a deep chord in the hearts of poor Eastern European Jews. They loved the mysticism of this style of worship. They loved cultivating a deep personal connection to God, one that didn't require years of scholarship or a strong grasp of the finer points of Jewish law. They loved the stories and the prayer and the dancing and the songs, and above all, they loved the joy that they found in this growing movement. There was no asceticism here, no snobbery, no strict rationality, only a sense of being deeply beloved, cherished by God and by fellow Jews. The Baal Shem Tov reminded his students that God loved them all with equal fervor, from the simplest water carrier to the most elite scholar. He made common folk feel, for the first time, that they mattered. They had been put on earth for a unique purpose that no one else could fulfill. And he taught them that with enough practice, they could achieve a transcendental relationship with God, a sort of oneness with the source of all life. To the common folk, all of this was a revelation.
So the Baal Shem Tov, way before psychedelics, was the first person to step up and democratize the spiritual experience. He recentered that back to the core of Torah, the core of Judaism, was to live in divine awareness with Source. He opened up the ecstatic experiential side, not to believe in God as a theory, to have faith, because I know there's a God out there, even though my life is miserable. But when life is hard and difficult and overwhelming, to close down the external mind and open up to a direct divine experience and revelation, all the supernatural power and transformational healing energy that comes from that. More radical than that, he said you don't have to be a master of all the Talmud or all the Torah to access that.
When the Baal Shem Tov said that every Jew could cultivate a deep, personal relationship with God, he meant it. And soon, Jewish women were going just as hard as the men, singing and praying and meditating and seeking God as full participants.
There's no question that the Hasidic movement was really challenging norms on a whole pile of areas. And one of the many sort of like side effects of challenging the norms is it also meant that women could challenge the norm. And that's why you have some fascinating growth of really interesting and unusual women who become Hasidic leaders. Many of the Rebbitzins, maybe the wives of the Rebbes themselves, often attain tremendous prominence, sometimes catering to female audiences and sometimes catering to general audiences. Don't forget that this is a period of tremendous change in general. Technology is advancing rapidly. You have the growth of far more printed materials available. You have political change afoot. You have all kinds of things going on. So all of a sudden, women have more and more roles to play in this new Hasidic movement, and they're defining new roles for themselves.
Of course, they upheld Jewish religious norms. There was no mixed dancing, no inappropriate mingling. Women were still expected to be wives, mothers, and homemakers. But they were also expected to cultivate an intimate relationship with the divine and to seek joy while fulfilling their unique purpose. So it's no wonder that the movement took off. By the end of the century, decades after the Baal Shem Tov himself had passed away, his students were spreading his message far and wide. Soon, the rabbinic elites took notice. They did not like what they saw.
People look in the Hasidic world today from modern American perspective, and they think it's the most conservative, most conformist, most old school culture maybe in the world. This started as the most countercultural avant-garde revolutionary movement in the world, and at its core it still is.
But authority figures generally don't appreciate countercultural movements. Things were about to get ugly between the Hasidim and the old guard elites, who soon styled themselves as Misnagdim, which literally means opponents.
By the time you get to the late 18th century and the early 19th century, there's a war going on. It gets really awful. People are thrown in jail left and right. Book burnings, bans, all kinds of really nasty stuff. The Misnagdim were saying this Hasidic movement is totally antinomian. That's kind of like a fancy word meaning against the laws. They're not following Jewish law.
So the Misnagdim used every tool in their arsenal to denounce this new movement. The Hasidim were too raucous, too much singing, too much dancing, too much vodka. It was unseemly. And what was all this nonsense about mysticism for the masses? In Jewish tradition, only the most learned scholars were allowed to delve into the secrets of the Kabbalah, because mysticism and metaphysics are the most complex parts of the Jewish tradition. According to the Misnagdim, without the foundation of Jewish law, mysticism can lead to idolatry. But here were ordinary people who could barely make it through a page of the Talmud, going on and on about mysticism and metaphysics and cultivating a personal relationship with God. At best, this was sheer chutzpah. At worst, it was heresy. Hasidim had committed the ultimate sin, at least in the eyes of this rabbinic elite. They had separated themselves from the community. They had their own style of prayer and their own synagogues, their own stringencies of kosher slaughter and their own songs and stories. They had their own Jewish curriculum and their own ideas about what was proper. In short, they were upending everything. And everyone knew what happened the last time a charismatic mystic took it on himself to change everything. Nearly a century before the Baal Shem Tov came on the scene, a false messiah had upended the Jewish world. Decades later, the Jewish world still hadn't recovered.
An individual called Shabbatai Tzvi came to power. Lo and behold, he led in the mystical, in the experiential, and gave many people access to that. Lo and behold, he started to really rebel, doing things that I wouldn't say in this video, but if people hear, they'd be shocked. He suddenly announced across Europe that he was the Mashiach. It's a time of pogroms of ultimate darkness, and a light went through all Jewish Europe that said, maybe this is it. And within 2 years, the movement collapsed, and he converted to Islam and devastated the entire Jewish community. But the rabbis at the time stood up and said, Jewish mystical practice must remain underground. They said this can never be public again. Therefore, the environment the Baal Shem Tov stepped into, especially the rabbinic leadership, were hypersensitive that this was another Shabbatai Tzvi in the process, and they were fast to clamp down.
But there was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The Hasidim were very attached to their traditions, to their rabbis, and to their vision of Judaism. No amount of scolding was going to change their devotion. But maybe excommunication would do the trick? Lithuania's most prominent rabbi, a man so learned he is known to this day as the genius of Vilnius, led the charge against the Hasidim. Like them, he was deeply immersed in the world of Kabbalah and mysticism. But that's where the similarity stopped. Where Hasidim believed in mysticism for the masses, he believed the mysteries of the Kabbalah should be open only to the most elite scholars. Where Hasidim emphasized joy, he was an ascetic, totally uninterested in pleasures like eating or sleeping. And he had absolutely no intention of letting these rabble-rousers do any more damage than they already had. So he excommunicated them all. The Jewish concept of excommunication is rooted in the Torah. But by the time the 18th century rolled around, the rabbis had developed an entire protocol around banishing people from the community. Shunning might not sound like a big deal, but remember, Judaism is a peoplehood. It's a communal religion. We pray together, celebrate together, mourn together. It's literally impossible to fully practice Judaism on your own. But the Hasidim were not on their own. By this point, they were a massive movement, a force to be reckoned with, no matter how hard their opponents tried. And their opponents really tried. Today, this battle might seem ridiculous to some of us, because in practice, there are very few differences between a Chassid and a Misnagdim. They had a different approach to Jewish education and emphasized different values. But when it came to rituals, to actual Jewish practice, their differences were on smaller issues. They argued over things like how sharp the blade used in ritual slaughter should be, or the latest time you can pray in the morning. So it was important, at least to them. So important, in fact, that Misnagdim burned Hasidic texts, wary of the heresy they might contain. So important that Misnagdim banned their children from mingling or, God forbid, marrying Hasidim. In a moment of utter darkness for the Jewish people, some Misnagdim even turned to the Tsar with wild stories of Hasidic leaders being spies and dissidents. The Tsarist authorities were not fans of the Jews or subversion of any sort. The Misnagdim who set the authorities on Hasidic leaders knew that there were very real chances that these rabbis would never leave prison, and yet their animosity was so strong that they turned the authorities against their fellow Jews. It was a dark and terrible moment in Jewish history.
So there's no question that the Misnagdim were on the defensive, and a lot of the attacks on the Hasidim were motivated by that defensive position. The Hasidim, however, were certainly not innocent of any kind of undermining of Misnagdic intent. And don't forget, we're talking about competition for scarce economic resources. That, if you're going to have one rabbi in town, is it going to be one of these newfangled Hasidic rabbis? Is that going to change everything? That's also a whole new revenue stream through the communal taxes. So there's definitely real competition, and there's actually some nastiness going both ways.
For nearly a century, the two groups were at odds. It was Capulets and Montagues, Hatfields and McCoys. And it might have stayed that way forever, if not for the Haskalah. The Enlightenment had swept through Europe beginning in the 17th century. But it came to the Jews nearly 100 years later, when German Jews first got the idea that maybe Jews and Christians were in fact equals. I know, it's radical. Like their non-Jewish counterparts, the so-called Maskilim, or enlightened Jews, believed in reason and education.
I was a student in the university there.
At first, they tried to reconcile their ancient religion with the modern age. Some of the leading figures of the Jewish Enlightenment were fully observant and saw no issue with practicing Judaism while also keeping up with modern culture. Very quickly, though, the movement took on a secular tinge as some Maskilim began to argue for reforming Judaism. And that is how Reform Judaism got its name. You ever hear the expression, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Well, to both Hasidim and Misnagdim, these enlightened Jews were the enemy, which made Hasidim and Misnagdim friends? It turned out that their differences were minuscule compared to what the Maskilim were proposing. Reforming Judaism? Mingling with non-Jews? Building a secular Jewish state without waiting for the Messiah? Had the world lost its mind?
The Haskalah comes in and says, you guys are arguing about how sharp versus how durable the blade can be when you slaughter an animal in terms of kosher. But we were actually thinking of having shellfish tonight. You are arguing about what time exactly Shabbat should begin and end, but we were thinking of literally moving Shabbat to Sunday to fit in with our non-Jewish neighbors. And when the Hasidim and the Misnagdim realized that the Haskalah is really gaining force, particularly in Germany, in France, and so on, they say, wait a second, hold the horses.
Suddenly, the two groups who had fought each other so bitterly found themselves on the same side. That was the side of tradition, of observing Jewish law, of not mingling too much with the outside world. To this day, Hasidim and Misnagdim all over the world have much more in common with each other than with most other Jews, though Misnagdim as a title has fallen out of fashion. These days, they're not really opponents anymore, and so we refer to them mostly as Litvish, a nod to their Lithuanian roots. Both Hasidic and Litvish communities were utterly decimated by the Holocaust. But the few survivors found the strength to rebuild, transporting their famed yeshivot to Jerusalem or New York, and creating a world that has long since vanished. And that's one reason, though not the only one, that both communities have so many children. They're repopulating a world that tried and failed to erase them. It's the ultimate act of rebellion from people who look anything but rebellious. But both Hasidim and Litvish Jews are utterly countercultural. They reject secular norms around dress, around food, around gender roles, around the definition of success. Most, though not all, avoid the internet, TV, secular books, even secular society. Like all insular communities, Hasidim are an endless source of fascination to outsiders. They're aware that the outside world perceives them with a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and sometimes hostility. But like all revolutionaries, they don't pay much attention to what the outside world has to say.
It's astonishing to see from Netflix, from social media, how people perceive us. So when people look at me or some of our students and friends and say, "Why on earth would you like to do that?" we laugh because we know what's happening on the inside, what gift that is to our community, our friends, our students, our children. It is the most profound understanding of all of human consciousness and psychology, way ahead of its time, and the tools and the skill set for every human being to live with divine experience, to heal, to transform, to overcome fears and doubts, and live accessing, channeling your highest state, your divine nature.
So, who are the Hasidim? They're scholars and mystics, radicals and revolutionaries. They've profoundly influenced modern Judaism. They're fiercely protective of their way of life because they have found deep meaning in a chaotic world. And that is something to be proud of.